Thank you all very much for coming. It's lovely to have you with us. I'm Dave Cullen. I'm a policy fellow at BASIC and also the program manager of the Emerging Voices Network. First of all, at the top, I should say that this webinar is being recorded. It is a webinar in Zoom, so only the panelists should be on camera. Although if you're asking questions later on, you can be on camera if you wish. And so just to let you know, first of all, I should give thanks to the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who have very graciously supported this policy cycle and previous policy cycles of the EVN. Very delighted to be bringing this anthology to you. I hope you'll agree that after you've heard our presentations today, that it's a really excellent set of policy papers. You can find the PDF up on the BASIC website now, and I'll also put a link in the meeting chat in just a moment. We are first of all going to hear from our keynote speaker, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and then each working group will present their paper. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A for all of the working groups. You can raise a hand if you want to ask a question or post in the Q&A, and then we'll take all the questions at the end. If you are posting the Q&A, please indicate which group you are addressing the question to, and also if it's a written question or if you'd like me to ask you to give it verbally. And now I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Anaïs Maurer, who is Assistant Professor of French and Comparative Literature at Rutgers University. Her research explores indigenous decolonial ecologies with a focus on nuclear imperialism and climate justice. Her first monograph, The Ocean on Fire, Pacific Stories from Nuclear Survivors to Climate Activists, analyzes Pacific artists' transgenerational fight against the nuclear arms race and climate change by underscoring the environmental racism at the roots of both existential threats. Go ahead, Anaïs.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you, Marururua. Thank you in particular to Declan Penrose and Dave Cullen, and of course to all the authors of this wonderful anthology. It's really an honor to be a speaker for the launch of this wonderful book. It was enlightening to discover the work of these next generation leaders, because this anthology offers a fresh outlook on nuclear issues while honoring the work of previous nuclear thinkers. I think it stands out for its considerable breadth, because in just 5 short policy papers, the authors offer a wide variety of solutions for nuclear harm reduction. And those solutions range from practical and easily implemented technical fixes, like, for example, using AI in nuclear waste management, which could be done virtually overnight, to more ambitious and perhaps epoch-defining goals, like the abolition of all nuclear weapons. What I find particularly inspiring in this anthology is its ability to dismantle the artificial binaries that have marred and continue to mar the field of nuclear studies. And throughout the book, readers are invited to consider the nuclear industrial complex in its temporal and geographic entirety, from uranium mining to waste storage, from frontline indigenous communities in the Pacific to military veterans in the United States, from nuclear harm mitigation to nuclear harm reparations. This is particularly important because the concept of nuclear harm in public discourse in the global north is often misrepresented. Nuclear threats tend to be associated in mainstream media and political discourse with speculative futures, like the threat of nuclear war or of nuclear plants accidents. This is problematic because the assumed victim of nuclear harm in these speculative disaster scenarios is often a white urban resident of the global north, when in reality, nuclear harm has historically been inflicted primarily on rural, on indigenous people, and has disproportionately affected women and children. This is, of course, I'm not trying to say that there's no risk of nuclear war or nuclear accidents in the global north, far from it. But frontline communities bearing the brunt of nuclear harm are racialized and gendered in specific ways. And this anthology, throughout the 5 chapters, this anthology constantly reminds it. From the beginning of the nuclear fuel cycle, uranium is most likely to be mined on indigenous land. Whether in Kazakhstan, Australia, Canada, or the US, in all of these countries, indigenous communities have been displaced to make room for mining and have been heavily affected by the radon-induced health issues linked to the mines. After having been mined on stolen land, radioactive material will be used either in the civil nuclear industry, in the military nuclear industry, or in both, because we know that they're both incredibly intertwined. The military nuclear industry is again primarily located on indigenous land. Nuclear testing sites and missile silos are systematically in the West, systematically situated far from nuclear countries' economic and political centers. The first 5 countries to develop atomic bombs, the US, the USSR, the UK, France, and China, all conducted their tests on indigenous land, on Navajo, Marshallese, Kazakh, Aboriginal, Ikribas, Amazigh, Maohi, and Uyghur land, among others. Like uranium mining, nuclear testing thus reenacts settler acts of land dispossession. And the same goes for the end of the nuclear fuel cycle, also analyzed in this anthology, which reminds that despite the technological progress that has been made when it comes to storing nuclear waste, there's still huge risks coming from the civil nuclear industry, from the end cycle of the civil nuclear industry. Once again, nuclear waste sites are often located on indigenous land already contaminated by previous nuclear testing. It's clear that national priority was given to securing nuclear plants located near populated and predominantly white areas, rather than ensuring the safety of nuclear storage facilities, mostly located near indigenous communities. The environmental racism at the core of military nuclear technology thus also informs civil nuclear technology. And the people who predominantly bear nuclear harm are not only racialized, they're also gendered in specific ways. Women are more likely to develop cancers as a result of exposure to radioactive fallout. Women also bear the brunt of reproductive issues linked to radioactivity exposure, such as infertility, miscarriages, and molar pregnancies, the infamous pregnancies that reported in the Marshall Islands, for example, as jelly babies. And as primary caregivers in most families, women are disproportionately affected by the challenges of raising children with disabilities and taking care of their relatives after they become sick due to radiation exposure. It's therefore crucial to change the discourse around nuclear harm and to think of speculative victims alongside real, historically affected communities and survivors. The chapters of this anthology all start from this historical reality and then go on to build new solidarities between past and future victims of nuclear harm. They offer policy suggestions that tackle these stereotypes and the artificial divisions in the nuclear industrial complex to offer a broad, holistic picture of who victims of nuclear harm have been and could be. For example, they tackle the division between the civil and the military nuclear cycles. The various chapters unite test survivors in the Marshall Islands and civil nuclear workers in the US in the same anti-nuclear fight. These chapters also challenge the division between past and future nuclear threats, uniting survivors of uranium mining and victims of a potential nuclear winter in a shared nuclear struggle. Last but not least, the authors of this anthology also challenged the artificial boundary between 2 existential threats, perhaps the two important existential threats of the 21st century, nuclear Armageddon on the one hand and climate collapse on the other hand. This is a bold and important take, because in Western countries, again, anti-nuclear activists and climate activists tend to fight in separate trenches, barely talking to each other. Many environmental activists are in fact pro-nuclear on the ground that nuclear power, as reminded in the anthology, is a low-carbon form of energy production. But nuclear issues and climate issues are inextricably linked. Climate instability increases geopolitical tensions and thus heightens the risks of an all-out nuclear war. It also increases the risks of nuclear accidents. You know that nuclear power plants are all located near water sources, such as rivers and oceans. As sea levels rise and rivers are more and more frequently subjected to droughts, nuclear power is at greater risk of catastrophic nuclear accidents. Conversely, while the climate issue heightens the nuclear risks issues, it's also true that the nuclear risks heighten the climate crisis. The nuclear arms race itself has a tremendous carbon footprint and largely contributes to the environmental crisis. And as the authors of this anthology remind, a new nuclear war would have a horrifying climate impact, triggering a decades-long nuclear winter. So both nuclear threats and climate threats are overwhelmingly affect primarily racialized and gendered communities, as both nuclear pollution and fossil fuel pollution make racialized people bear the brunt of contemporary environmental devastation. Therefore, nuclear threats and climate threats should be and are in this anthology analyzed together, not only because they reinforce each other, but also because they stem from the same ideological root. And it's important to tackle these ideological roots to avoid proposing superficial solutions to this problem. Because both proponents of the atom and believers in fossil fuel infinite growth believe in man's ability to control nature, or in some humans' ability to control nature, and trust that more technological breakthroughs can solve the issues created by technological innovation in the first place. So instead of conceiving of nuclear war and climate collapse as two distinct scenarios that could threaten most life on Earth, it's more generative to think of them as inextricably linked in the nuclearized Anthropocene. This anthology refuses to silo these questions and tackles these two man-made, imperial-made existential threats together in their policy suggestions. From its analysis of nuclear waste management in low-carbon nuclear power plants to its study of the climate consequences of so-called strategic nuclear strikes, they remind that it's important to think of nuclear and climate threats as always intertwined. In conclusion, I want to return to the words of Dave Collin in the introduction of this anthology. He writes that what ties the chapters together is, I quote, a quest for justice and a call for moral purpose, end quote. This year, we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of the Trinity test site of Hiroshima and of Nagasaki. People across nuclear-affected front lines continue to suffer from disproportionately high rates of cancers, leukemia, stillbirths, and genetic anomalies. Which begs the question, what form could nuclear justice take after such a crime? There are two ways to conceive of justice. One is retributive justice, seeking to punish the perpetrators. The other is reparative justice, focusing on repairing the harm done to the victims. The quest for nuclear justice is a global quest for reparative justice, the largest ever attempt to get perpetrators to sit with affected communities, to acknowledge the harm that they've done and continue to do, to try to redeem themselves and to commit not to perpetrate further harm. To the question, what is nuclear justice? We could reply with just three words: apologies, reparations, and accountability. We're still very far from obtaining this reparative justice. But as the papers in this anthology show, there is a clear path forward. And this path necessarily leads to the only valid guarantee of accountability, which is the abolition of all nuclear weapons. And it's in solidarity with this worthy goal that I now cede the floor to the talented authors of this inspiring anthology. Thank you very much, Marururoa.
Thank you so much, Anaïs, and thank you again for giving up your time to come and be our keynote speaker. It's very much appreciated. Really kind and inspiring words, wonderful. And I thought it was lovely to hear the links between the papers being drawn out more fully. For I think all of us who've been working on them, it's very easy to be very focused on the specifics of the paper, and I found it really rewarding once the papers have been being completed, looking at the links between them. So it's great to hear you draw those out, and also, of course, to speak about the link between nuclear policy and climate change, which is very important. Okay, without further ado, I will move on to Working Group 1, whose paper is entitled Solving the Radiological Waste Disposal Riddle. And I'll now introduce our speakers. So Abubakar Sadiq Aliyu is presently a nuclear research officer with the Center for Renewable Energy and Sustainability Transitions at Bayero University, Kano, Nigeria. He is also a fellow of the 2025 United Nations Disarmament Fellowship Program. Shaza Arif is a senior research associate at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, Islamabad, and an EVN board member. Her research interests include emerging and disruptive technologies. Over to you both.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Abubakar Sadiq Ali, as you rightfully mentioned, and myself and Shada Ali will be making the presentation. Here are some the members of our group, and the title of the topic is Solving the Radiological Waste Disposal Problem. Next slide. Yeah. One of the challenges of the nuclear industry is managing radioactive waste. And over the years, we've seen increase in interest in nuclear energy, especially with the respect to new technologies like the SMR. The IEA projects 2.5-fold in increase of nuclear capacity by the mid-century. This paper will focus on areas that has to do with artificial intelligence, partitioning and transportation, small modular reactors, and how they are related to waste management. Next slide. Radioactive waste have been classified into basically three. We have the low level, which is less radioactive, mostly contaminated clothes and tools that are being used by operators. And then the intermediate level waste, which is also higher in terms of radioactivity than the low level. This consists mainly of reactor water treatment residues from the power plants. And then you also have the high level waste, which is the highest in terms of radioactivity and consists mainly of spent nuclear fuels that have high level of radioactivity and also very, very hot. This type of waste requires a very good disposal, and geological disposal is one of the ways in which we can dispose that. Next slide. There are actually many types of waste disposal that have been proposed, but geological disposal stand out for very many reasons. And the concept of geological disposal is that of emplacement of nuclear waste in deep geological formations. That way, we should be able to conceal the waste so that they can be harmful to humans. And the rationale behind that is because the nature has been stable for a very long time, so it should be able to contain that. This method have been widely accepted for high-level waste disposal. Next slide. AI in waste management. There are several applications that can be harnessed of AI in waste management. Some of them include the classification and treatment of this waste, also predictive analysis of leak detection, robotic system for hazardous tasks, and also digital twin simulation for Scope 3 modeling. Next slide. Now, the partitioning and transmutation is also an emerging technology that can be used in separating and transforming long-life radionuclides to short life, because one of the challenges of this waste is they have a very long life of radioactive hazard period. So this technology can be able to reduce this hazard period from hundreds of years, 100,000s of years to probably 500 to 1,500 years. And it also lowers the peak dose rate in intrusion scenarios. So some of the challenges this technology is facing is technological development and integration, the need for fast spectrum reactors, and also proliferation risks and regulatory concerns. Next slide. There's also the question of small modular reactors, which the interests have been on the rise this day because they have they offer compact, scalable nature, but they also have different types of small modular reactors with different waste management strategies. So these are some of them. Next slide. So waste management strategies include early integration of waste concentration into some of these designs, and then use of dry cask and deep underground storage, and then exploration of waste minimization and reprocessing strategies. Next slide. So some of the key takeaways with respect to this presentation is one, AI can enhance operational efficiency and safety. PNT can reduce long-term radiotoxicity and heat generation, and small modular reactors offer flexibility, but then they have unique waste management challenges. I would hand over to Shaza for the recommendation part. Thank you.
Thank you, Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr has covered the three areas that we were covering, which included artificial intelligence, PNT technology, and SMR. The second section of our paper comprised of policy recommendations, which will be covered by me. The first recommendations that we propose include establishing a global framework for advanced nuclear waste governance. Now, this includes that the framework should include timelines for adoption of PNT and SMR as core components of national waste strategies. Second, in this ambit, we also propose establishing special licensing pathways and transport protocols that account for SMR-specific waste types and volumes, and initiating discussions for an international agreement to allow cross-border processing of nuclear waste with priority access for countries lacking mature PN3 infrastructure. Our second recommendation is the promotion of strategic investment in partition and transmutation. This includes launching a global industrialization fund for PNT and pyroprocessing, co-financed by nuclear states. It also includes expanding R&D towards resolving secondary waste issues, which is, again, one of the major issues that is being confronted. Likewise, it also includes promoting international financing options, like the World Bank Green Funds for ADS and fast-track development. And in the same context, we encourage national policy tools such as tax incentives, waste reduction mandates, and policy integration of PNT to improve operator buy-in. Our third recommendation includes the integration of AI and robotics for long-term waste management and monitoring. And in this, we propose launching pilot AI projects to model behavior of radioactive waste in deep geological repositories. We also propose funding robotics R&D for launching high radiotoxic spent fuel and SMR-specific waste streams. Likewise, developing a global roadmap for standardizing AI-driven monitoring in nuclear waste infrastructure over the next 2 decades. Our fourth recommendation comprised reinforcement of non-proliferation and safeguards for emerging fuel cycles. Now, in this context, we propose initiating early integration of PNT technologies into IAEA safeguards, expanding non-proliferation frameworks to cover new isotopes and material like uranium-233. Similarly, we propose working towards the amendment of the nuclear supplier group guidelines to reflect the proliferation risks posed by emerging fuel cycles, and developing monitoring protocols across the full life cycle of sensitive materials involved in PNT, including separation, transport, and storage. Our fifth recommendation comprised strengthening economic justification through holistic cost-benefit analysis. Now, this included supporting the development of clear cost-benefit models for PNT, employing analytical hierarchy process to compare open and closed fuel cycles, and likewise generating emphasis on previously under-considered value of reduced long-term intrusions and radiotoxicity risk as central benefit of PNT-enabled fuel cycles. Our last recommendation included integration of advanced fuel cycle and nuclear waste safeguards into non-proliferation diplomacy. It also included expanding nuclear mandates to cover non-proliferation risk from advanced waste processing. Likewise, it included ensuring community consultation and standardization of human health risk assessment as to be standardized. And lastly, launching international forums on AI in nuclear waste solutions and engaging the private sector. So this was from our side on how we see new technologies and the pre-existing technologies can be tailored as per requirements for the radiological waste. So thank you.
Thank you both very much. Thank you to Abu Bakr and to Shaza and to all of your working group members. As I said at the top, we will have questions for all of the working groups at the end after they've all presented. So next we have Working Group 2, whose paper is entitled Offsetting Harms Relating to the Front End of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle. Our presenter is Maheen Shafiq, who is a research associate at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. She holds a Master's in International Relations from the University of Sheffield, UK. Over to you, Maheen.
Thank you. So if you could take down the presentation so I can share my screen. Hello, everybody. This is Maheen Shafiq. I work as a research associate at the Institute of Strategic Studies here in Islamabad. My group and I worked on offsetting harms related to the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle. My group members included myself, Guillermo, Ksenia, Arifur Rahman, Taha, Lavinia, and Umar Farouk. In front of you is displayed the full nuclear fuel cycle, and what we have covered is the part highlighted in the blue, and specifically our paper discusses the mining aspect of the nuclear fuel cycle. We have seen that there is an increased demand of low carbon alternatives due to rising energy demands and rising climate concerns. This has led to a drive towards finding alternative sources of energy. We have seen that coal and gas have been used the most as a source of energy, but there are other alternative options such as hydro, solar, geothermal, as well as nuclear. You can see that there's a 9% use of nuclear energy, which is highlighted in blue, pink in the pie chart. So there is a scope of nuclear energy being used as an alternative source of energy. And we have seen this being stressed by IAEA, climate experts, as well as economists. IAEA General Director Rafael Mariano Grossi says that we need right sources of energy to meet SDGs and also Paris Agreement. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, several of their models have stated that we need low carbon sources of energy to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. Likewise, McKinsey says that scaling economies would need nuclear energy. This implies that if there's a demand for nuclear energy, there would be dependence on uranium mining. Looking at the uranium mines globally, we can see that Kazakhstan, Australia, Canada, Namibia, Nigeria are a few of the countries which are contributing the most towards uranium mines. And these are the regions where most uranium mines are located. But we have to see that if there's a demand for nuclear energy, we would see a rush towards uranium mining and uranium exploration. We saw that early in the 1950s, 1960s, and then again in the 1980s, and most recently in 2000s. And if this trend continues, there would be a rise in demand, which is expected to increase 66% by 2040. So this indicates that there could be a modern day uranium rush, which would lead countries towards uranium mining. And therefore, it is important to address the adverse effects of uranium mining, and which is why our paper discusses the offsetting harms related to the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle. In our paper, we have looked at 4 different harms related to uranium mining. We've looked at the health and environmental harms. As discussed by Anaïs, we have discussed land rights and revenues, IAEA safeguards and proliferation risks and harm, and the geopolitics of uranium mining, which is very important in current context. Looking at the health harms, we've analyzed that there is not only the radiological exposure, but there's also non-radiological exposure. We have seen that radiological exposure can lead to risk of lung cancer, leukemia, and other respiratory diseases. But we found out that non-radiological exposures can not only lead to health concerns, but also the extreme working conditions and limited safety standards is a very much concern for not only the miners, but also the local community, local and the indigenous community. In terms of the environmental harms, we saw that there are 3 types of uranium mining. There's an open pit mining, which leads to soil degradation and destruction of the surrounding ecosystem. Underground mining leads to release of radioactive material into the nearby rivers, especially the agricultural land, and in-situ mining, which includes toxic materials and is heavily practiced in Kazakhstan. This leads to contamination of groundwaters, especially, which is crucial for local population. In our study, we've recommended that it is important to follow SDGs, especially SDG number 6, regarding clean water and sanitation, responsible consumption and production, and peace, justice, and strong institutions could lead to mitigation of health and environmental risks. Second aspect that we looked into is the land rights and revenue. We saw that mining contracts are signed behind doors, which leaves local population disadvantaged, and mining companies and government secure most benefit out of this. So we recommended in our study that common resource pool framework should be adopted, which is an equitable governance structure, which can lead to good balance of profit and benefits for locals as well as the government and the mining company. In this regard, we have mentioned that it is the government that is the neutral negotiator that supports conflict resolution, and it facilitates fair revenue sharing ideas and also safeguard community rights. But we've also discussed that mining companies also have responsibilities. It is important that mining companies includes local in decision-making and higher authority positions. They allow participation of local is, for instance, the employment. And we've specially mentioned that women-led enterprises should also be included in the benefits regarding the mining, which the mining company secures. Third aspect that we've discussed is the IAEA safeguards and proliferation harms and risks. In this, we have discussed that IAEA safeguards are covered in the area in the nuclear fuel cycle highlighted in the red square, but we recommend that IAEA safeguards should expand to the whole nuclear fuel cycle, which should especially include mining and milling, which are not really considered in this regard. We have recommended that additional protocols should be expanded. So, and the main purpose should be to stress transparency. We've mentioned in our paper that although proliferation risks at the mining level are less, but there are concerns of state diversion, unauthorized access by non-state actors, as well as there are concerns regarding illicit extraction, theft, and trafficking. Moving on to the fourth aspect of the geopolitics of uranium mining, we've seen earlier in the keynote address that uranium is being used for energy, but it's also being used for defense purposes. And we've seen that conflicts around the world lead to sanction, and these aspects are used as political leverages, and it risks energy security. Most of the countries in the Eastern Europe are dependent on Russian fuel assembly and Russian supply chain because their systems are as per Russian influence. So, which is why it is important that they need to diversify their sources of uranium mining so they do not get entangled in the geopolitics of the ongoing conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. Because this is leading to militarization of uranium sites. We have seen that nuclear power plants are being targeted in Ukraine and Iran, and this becomes really concerning that uranium sites can also become one of the target and can become entangled in the geopolitics. As part of our recommendation, we have recommended that there is a need to extend transparency measures to unregulated stages of the nuclear fuel cycle. This would, again, enhance transparency throughout the nuclear fuel cycle, which we saw also discussed by the previous speakers. There's a need to establish global convention on environmental and safety standards in uranium mining. This would lead to an international agreement, a binding agreement where safety standards are considered very important regarding uranium mining. We recommended that strengthening and expanding IAEA oversight across uranium supply chain. Again, this would strengthen international monitoring on the nuclear supply chain or uranium supply chain. And most importantly, we stress that there's a need to institutionalize domestic safety standards and community protocol in order to save the local indigenous communities. Then we've recommended that there's a need to align trade policy with environmental and human rights compliances. Next, we've recommended that there's a need to create economic resilience mechanism for mining regions, especially those that are prone to conflict and wars. And then most importantly, we have suggested that even after mine closure, there's a need to establish trust funds so that the region can continue supporting. We have seen that mines, even after closure, have had negative impact on health, economic situation of the area, of the indigenous community, and a trust fund would help strengthen the community even after the mine closure. And lastly, we recommended that there's a need to guarantee community representation, especially in and protect sites in armed conflicts. So these are some of our ideas that we have gathered, in my group and I have gathered over the course of past few months. And these are our recommendations for addressing harms related to front end of the nuclear fuel cycle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maheen. That was really fascinating. If you are listening and you have any questions, do feel free to put those in the Q&A and they'll be addressed at the end. We'll next move on to working group 3, whose paper is entitled Limited War, Unlimited Consequences, Integrating the Global Environmental Impact of Nuclear Conflict into Contemporary Deterrence Thinking. And our presenter today is Amanda Nahan Pereira, who is a master's student in international public affairs. She currently interns with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, working in the terrorism prevention branch. Previously, she spent 2 years at Brazil's Securities and Exchange Commission, focusing on anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and WMD production. WMD proliferation. Over to you, Amanda.
Hi, Dave. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me begin by thanking my fellow co-chair, Cia de Bateau, for her leadership and close collaboration. This afternoon, I'll be presenting our paper, and it reflects the work of our dedicated working group, which brought together experts to connect cutting-edge in climate science with nuclear policy and deterrence strategies. So today, all nuclear armed states are modernizing their arsenals. The US alone plans to spend over 1.5 trillion to overhaul its nuclear triad and boost warhead production, extending the life of global stockpiles for decades. A key part of this is preparing for limited nuclear war, where a number of nuclear weapons might be used to achieve tactical goals or prevent conventional defeat. Scenarios include deterring escalation, responding to cyber or chemical attacks, or regaining control of lost weapons. Advances in precision and lower yield warhead risk, making nuclear use more likely. At the same time, nuclear dangers are growing. For example, with Russia's action in Ukraine, where there has been featured open nuclear threats, and its revised doctrine reportedly permitting nuclear retaliation not only in existential threats, but also against large conventional attacks. Meanwhile, arms control is collapsing. With key treaties failing and Russia pulling back from CTBT, we are entering a more unstable nuclear era driven by geopolitical tension and new technologies and in urgent need of global collaboration. Nuclear war isn't just a security threat, it's also a global environmental catastrophe. Using advanced climate models like WACCM, scientists have shown that even a regional nuclear conflict could release 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere, cooling the planet by 1.5 Celsius degrees for over a decade, and disrupting monsoons, depleting ozone, and crippling global agriculture. A full-scale war between the US and Russia would be far worse. 150 million tons of soot would be released, causing a 9-degree temperature drop, slash global rainfall by 30%, collapse the food system, and expose much of the planet to harmful UV radiation. These impacts would be worldwide and long-lasting, affecting even countries not directly involved. In short, nuclear war threatens climate collapse. This must transform how we approach deterrence and disarmament by putting environmental and human security at the center of nuclear policy. Current nuclear deterrence strategies were built during the Cold War. They focus on second strike capabilities, escalation control, and mutual destruction, but they ignore 21st century realities. First, the threat landscape has changed. Cyber attacks, AI, and instability leaders along the world have introduced new risks that could trigger nuclear use by miscalculation, miscommunication. Second, these strategies fail to account for what science tells us about nuclear conflict, because even limited exchange could plunge the world into a nuclear winter, causing global temperature drops, crop failure, and famine, even in non-belligerent countries. Despite this, climate impacts are rarely considered in nuclear policy. Deterrence today assumes that nuclear war is politically and militarily containable, but its environmental consequences are anything but contained. As arms control regimes collapse and nuclear modernization accelerates, we face rising risks with outdated thinking. A credible deterrence framework must now include climate science and global human security. This shift could pave the way for new strategies that prioritize sustainability and survival over mutual destruction. So our group drafted 5 recommendations. The first one, to prohibit the use of nuclear threats in armed conflict. The second one is to institutionalize and expand the UN scientific panel on nuclear war impacts. The third one, to strengthen the climate nuclear focus across key multilateral forums. The fourth, integrating climate impact assessment into the NPT Article 6 implementation. And the last one, the fifth, integrate climate risk into strategic stability and risk reduction frameworks. Looking more into some of them, because we don't have the time to go over all. Recommendation 3, strengthening the climate nuclear focus across multilateral forums. We show how if we are serious about preventing the humanitarian environmental consequences of nuclear war, then climate risks must be integrated into how we approach nuclear policy, not just as a side note, but as a core concern. To do this, we need to mobilize the institutions that already shape global climate and security thinking. So first, the UN Environmental Programme could take the lead by establishing a time-limited expert group on extreme environment disruptions, including nuclear winter. This would help translate scientific research into actionable policy. Second, the UN Security Council should build on its climate security mandate by holding dedicated debates on the nuclear climate nexus, highlighting the threat that nuclear conflict poses to international peace and stability. Third, the Conference on Disarmament could benefit from regular scientific briefings on the environmental consequences of nuclear use, grounding its discussion in current data and risk assessments. And finally, regional organizations like Asian, African Union, and the Organization of America's States should explore how nuclear-related climate shocks intersect with existing climate adaptation and disaster preparedness strategies. In short, if we want credible security frameworks, we must embed climate science into nuclear governance before it's too late. And the fourth recommendation, we look into how we could integrate climate impact assessment into the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6. If we want disarmament to be meaningful in today's world, we need to measure its environmental benefits and not just its military dimensions. So the NPT already provides a framework for the Article 6, which obligates states to pursue disarmament. But so far, it overlooks one critical piece, which is climate impact. First, we propose to establish a working group with the NPT to develop climate disarmament metrics, so nuclear armed states can show how arsenal reductions reduce environmental risks. Second, we require climate impact assessments in states' regular reports to the NPT, especially in the sections on disarmament. This makes environmental responsibility part of transparency and accountability for member states. Third, a commission of expert studies to identify which nuclear system pose the most environmental threat. This would help to identify and prioritize which weapons should go first. And together, these measures would embed climate security into the NPT in a practical, measurable way, reinforcing both disarmament, commitments, and global environmental goals. To conclude, it's clear that we need a fundamental rethinking of how we approach nuclear deterrence. Current frameworks still rely on Cold War logic, but they ignore the climatic consequences of even unlimited nuclear exchange, from nuclear winter to global food system collapse. That gaps undermine the credibility of arms control and increases the risk of catastrophic miscalculation. If we are serious about reducing these risks, then deterrence strategies must evolve to recognize not just the military, but the environmental and humanitarian costs of nuclear war. That means expanding scientific research, embedding climate risks into security dialogues, and strengthening multilateral arms control. Only then we can build a nuclear strategy that is not just strategically sound, but also environmentally responsible and globally sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks, of course, also to Saida Patul and the other working group members from that group. I think, incidentally, I failed to thank the other members of working group too, so thanks to them, including, of course, Guillermo, who was the other working group chair. Thanks to everyone who's put a question in the chat. Please continue to do that as you're listening to the working groups. Next, we have Working Group 4, whose paper is entitled Nuclear Testing and Displacement in the Pacific, Integrating Transitional Justice into the Nuclear Justice Framework. Our first of our two presenters is S. Nivedita, who is a research fellow with the Energy Law and Policy team at the National University of Singapore, where her research explores law and policy issues across the energy, nuclear, ocean, security, and environmental sectors. She is also part of the EVN board. And our other presenter is Shagaye Chris Rostampor Verjari, who is a policy and advocacy professional passionate about advancing human security, disarmament, and social justice centered on impacted communities. An immigrant with a background in journalism and peace studies, Shagaye brings research skills, lived experience, and strategic expertise to policy and advocacy efforts. Over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Nivedita, and as Dave introduced, along with my co-chair Shay, it's a real privilege to be here with you today, representing our working group as we share more about our work in this policy cycle. You can find the names of our wonderful working group members listed on the slide, and a big shout out to those members listening in today. Our policy paper, as Dave mentioned, is titled Nuclear Testing and Displacement in the Pacific, Integrating Transitional Justice into the Nuclear Justice Framework. The impact of nuclear testing on displaced communities, including indigenous and native groups, is often overlooked when discussing nuclear harm. Displacement is just one facet of the broader impacts of nuclear testing, which are deeply interconnected with other forms of harm. As was mentioned in the keynote earlier, it is crucial to change the discourse of nuclear harm from speculative victims with historical survivors. As such, for our case study for our policy paper, we focused on the displacement of Pacific Islanders due to nuclear testing conducted by the United States between 1946 and 1958. This case study is particularly relevant as the US conducted over 1,000 tests in the region, profoundly affecting communities, especially indigenous ones. And of course, it's also a case study where there's substantial information available for us to work with. Our paper aims to set out an analytical framework that integrates transitional justice into the nuclear justice discourse. It examines the communities displaced by nuclear testing in the Pacific Islands and evaluates the extent to which these communities have achieved nuclear justice within an integrated framework. Additionally, we propose specific recommendations to address gaps in remediation and reparations. Our hope is that this paper will contribute to advancing core transitional justice goals, such as establishing truth, ensuring justice, providing reparations, guaranteeing non-recurrence, and preserving memory. Over to you, Shay.
Thank you so much, Nivi, and thank you to the EVN team for giving us this opportunity. So I'll present our integrated approach to transitional justice and nuclear justice, focusing on U.S. testing in the Marshall Islands. So our analytical framework builds on past work, and we have adapted transitional justice pillars as defined by the UN Human Rights Council and contextualized them to nuclear harms, particularly displacement. So very briefly, I'll explain what these pillars are. Truth is the first pillar, which means that victims and everybody else has the right to know what happened and why. And this includes the health, environmental, and political impacts of U.S. nuclear testing in the Pacific in the case of our case study. Justice is what Anaïs referred to earlier as retributive justice. It involves legal accountability, criminal tribunals, and such, which remains lacking in the case of nuclear justice. Existing mechanisms like the Nuclear Claims Tribunal have existed, however, they have not been adequate to address the harms. Reparations include compensation, which again, reparative justice is how Anaïs referred to this pillar. It includes compensation, care, and cleanup. However, in our case study, many Marshallese are still displaced or ill as a result of nuclear testing and development. Memorialization ensures harm is publicly remembered. One example of this is the 2023 U.S. Marshall Islands Memorandum of Understanding, which proposes museums and research facilities. And guarantees of non-recurrence requires dismantling the systems that enabled nuclear harms in the first place. Now, let's turn to our case study, the Marshall Islands. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, tens of the many that Nivi referred to earlier, totaling over 100 megatons, most notably at Bikini and Eniwetok atolls. The U.S. nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands forcibly displaced hundreds of indigenous Marshallese, particularly from Bikini and Eniwetok. Bikini Islanders were relocated multiple times and they faced food shortages and cultural disconnection. Promises of return were broken, and even when they did go back, some went back, they were evacuated again due to dangerous radiation exposure that was not known in the past. The people of Eniwetok suffered a similar fate, moved to a smaller island, and then later allowed back, only to find parts of their island permanently contaminated and turned into nuclear waste sites. Displacement itself led to widespread poverty, dependency on U.S. aid, and a loss of cultural ties. Radiation exposure caused long-term health impacts, including cancer, miscarriages, and birth defects, compounded by unethical U.S. medical experiments. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of this damage. Today, the Marshallese remain displaced and their islands physically and culturally scarred by the legacy of nuclear testing. The legal struggle for justice began in 1980s. The U.S. settled claims with a $150 million fund and created a tribunal. But the tribunal ran out of funds very quickly, and the U.S. has since declared the matter closed. The 2023 Memorandum of Understanding offers some new hope, promises access to documents and funding for medical care and memorialization, but compensation remains partial, unfortunately. Finally, Marshallese efforts continue today, nationally through the National Nuclear Commission and internationally through advocacy for the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has a victim assistance clause, and resolutions at the United Nations Human Rights Council. In short, while there are entry points for justice, our research shows that the full application of transitional justice pillars remains far from being realized. Our aim is to help map that path forward, and with that, over to Nivi to list some of our policy recommendations to move forward.
Thanks, Shay. So turning to policy recommendations, we've put forward 5 of them, both for immediate steps and longer-term action that aim to meet the different pillars of justice. Of course, these pillars aren't separate silos, they overlap and intersect, so it's really not possible to pursue one without engaging with the others. At the same time, we don't think it's appropriate for us to propose a single idea of what a just settlement should look like for displaced communities, especially without including their voices and experiences. As the transitional justice framework that Shay outlined highlights, meaningful participation and inclusion of affected communities, along with the impartiality and neutrality of any mechanisms, are absolutely essential to achieving real justice. With that, our first recommendation is that the United States needs to acknowledge the full truth of its nuclear testing program, including the human experimentation studies, such as Project 4.1, it conducted in the Marshall Islands, and how these actions violated the rights of indigenous communities. Any future diplomatic engagement with the Marshall Islands should begin with the recognition of this harm. Over to you, Shay.
Thanks. Second, we also call for a Truth and Claims Commission to hear Marshallese testimonies, recommend reparations, and co-manage former nuclear test sites as living memorials. Inspired by New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi model, this independent Indigenous-informed body would ensure truth-telling, transparency, and public access to information. The 2023 U.S. Marshall Islands Memorandum of Understanding is a step forward, but true justice means centering Indigenous voices, as mentioned before, acknowledging historical harm and preserving memory through shared stewardship of affected lands. Over to you, Nivi.
Our next recommendation is that we should advance reparative justice. And here, to truly deliver reparations and compensation to Indigenous communities affected by nuclear testing and development, we need to reassess how damage is defined and measured. That includes clarifying the criteria used to link exposure to harm and who qualifies for compensation, especially for displaced individuals and communities. Back to you, Shay.
Thank you. And to achieve true nuclear justice, the U.S. must reform its relationship with the Marshall Islands beyond the Compact of Free Associations. That applies to other states having relations with the Marshall Islands as well. Current frameworks fall short of ensuring non-recurrence of harm. The Marshallese must be central in all advocacy, while the U.S. must respond directly to their demands. Other states must also promote inclusive diplomacy, bringing displaced community voices into international forums on victim assistance and environmental remediation. Justice must reflect lived experience and support long-term equitable repair.
Our last recommendation is to build durable guarantees of non-recurrence. Ensuring that such harms don't happen again means more than just promises. Real guarantees of non-recurrence involve political reforms, legal safeguards, and crucially, the inclusion of Pacific Islander voices in nuclear governance. To wrap up, Our proposals and this paper are just a starting point. There's still a long road ahead to properly address the legacy of displacement caused by nuclear weapons testing. This includes doing more work on our case study itself, but also applying the analytical framework we've developed to other contexts and communities. And just to underline the urgency, a very recent report by the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research revealed that the US officials asked the people of Bikini Atoll to leave their homeland in 1946 without telling them that nuclear tests had already been planned. It also highlights the long-term effects of that displacement on the Marshallese people. So yes, there is much more to be done. I want to leave you with this thought. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the risk of nuclear harm is never behind us. On behalf of our working group, thank you for listening. We invite you to read our policy paper, and we welcome your questions, your reflections, and your continued engagement in the pursuit of nuclear justice.
Thank you, Nivi. I also wanted to add that given that our paper focuses on displacement from nuclear testing and other papers here focused on nuclear harms, I wanted to acknowledge the ongoing displacement and other ties to and other harms tied to the existence and the threat of nuclear weapons today, including what's happening in the Middle East and Ukraine, where nuclear politics intersect with violence and instability. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks both very much, Nivi and Shay, and thanks, of course, also to all of the working group members who contributed to your paper. Next, last but by no means least, we have Group 5, whose paper is entitled Expanding the Definition of Atomic Veterans to Address Harms to Service People in Nuclear Missions. We have two presenters. Morgan Slessor is currently working as a researcher in Vancouver, Canada. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia and a master's degree in political science from the University of Waterloo. Christelle Barakat is a researcher at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. She is a Lebanese Fulbright Foreign Student Program graduate from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, holding an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies. Over to you both.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending here today. Morgan and I are very happy to be presenting on expanding the definition of atomic veterans to address harms to service people in nuclear missions. We would like to take a moment to thank all of the working group authors and contributors for all of their hard work that went into making this publication possible. And without further ado, we will begin with the presentation. So firstly, throughout history, there have been many instances where nuclear arms states have exposed their own service members to harmful levels of radiation and nuclear harms. In the 1970s and 80s in the United States, these individuals have become known as atomic veterans. However, the term atomic veterans is limited in its for a variety of reasons, most notably because it excludes members who have worked with nuclear materials and depleted uranium munitions. It also overstresses the physical aspect of things in terms of injuries and does not put enough stress on psychological injuries or trauma resulting from nuclear harms. And it uses more broad. It is used more broadly regarding members of the armed forces and not inclusive of other individuals who may have been exposed to such harms. As such, this paper seeks to identify the shortcomings of the term, as well as to recommend a new, more comprehensive, and more forward-looking definition of atomic veterans. Over to you, Morgan.
Thank you. The term atomic veteran is a legalistic definition which refers to service members who were at the Nevada test site or Hiroshima and Nagasaki between 1945 and 1962. There are obvious spatial and temporal limitations which prevent it from being widely applied to other service people who were exposed to nuclear radiation. And this population numbers in the hundreds of thousands. It's unclear exactly what the total number is. As a result, the U.S. or as a result of these cases, the U.S. domestic public demanded that compensation schemes were developed to compensate veterans who were harmed as a result of these tests. Under different jurisdictions, these were all geared towards the same thing, which was healthcare and compensation for veterans. They all entered into law between roughly the 1980s, the mid-1980s, into the 1990s, meaning that some veterans died without receiving any or adequate compensation at all. And these are ongoing projects which still have left atomic veterans outside of their care. As of 2024, RICA lapsed. This is the second time it's lapsed, meaning that it could be revived again. But this is an ongoing struggle. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Ultimately, these represent a mea culpa by the U.S. state, these compensation schemes, and that exposure which occurred should not happen again. And these most frequently occurred at the NTS, and that these examples are ultimately aberrant. As mentioned before, the result of the fact that they were so late, it took so much time for them to enter into force, meant that veterans were left uncared for, often with ailments which were untreated, and this is really severe. RICA alone has cost $2.6 billion. This is a lower bound estimate, and meaning that adjusting for inflation, the number could be much higher, not including the other two compensation schemes. And RICA has also lapsed as well, meaning that's sort of a closed issue. Although atomic veterans can receive treatment through other bills. Next slide, please. As evidenced by the prior slides, compensation schemes have been broadly inadequate to fully meet the needs of atomic veterans and to fully compensate them for the suffering they've endured. There still exists several bureaucratic and legal hurdles which further hinder atomic veterans' capacity to receive care, such as access to their medical and service records vis-a-vis these tests. How much were they exposed to? What treatment did they receive immediately after, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. case represents a very extreme yet well-documented example of harmful levels of exposure and what the most clear-cut example of being an atomic veteran is. And ultimately, our paper at the core sort of sought to address what are the duties of the service member and what constitutes an acceptable level of violence which a state can inflict on its citizens. As such, the U.S. cases form really strong examples of this unacceptable conduct, and this could help bridge this gap and help create a further understanding of what is acceptable versus what is not acceptable, and even a precedence for other service members who are exposed. Similar to the previous group, our findings were such that no law has been struck or no agreement has been struck to prevent this from happening again. Indeed, there are past examples like the nuclear tests. There are sort of present contemporary examples like depleted uranium rounds, and there are even examples of conflict points in the future, such as SMRs. And in order for the term atomic veteran to apply to these, the spatial and temporal elements would have to sort of be axed from them. But it's a clear show that this is a hot topic, even though testing as a vector for exposure is, the threats aren't as real as they once were. And thus the term atomic veteran is not particularly forward-looking, and it doesn't really benefit anyone now. And it's also been the site of like a cycle of violence in the past. Yeah, that's all for me. Next, on to you.
As such, based on all of the aforementioned and what was mentioned previously, we propose a modified, more comprehensive, and more compelling definition of atomic veterans. And this definition lays on 4 key pillars. Firstly, it should be more inclusive, so not just restricted to service members who serve as part of the armed forces, but inclusive of all individuals who are exposed to radiation while serving their country. It should be more historically accurate and detailed when it comes to nuclear testing. And what that means is it should encompass all of the dates when nuclear testing happened, as well as the different locations. And it should be consistently updated, relevant, and aligned with federal laws. So as new findings come to light, this definition should continuously be revised. And law reforms should also be taken into account in order to make the definition more compelling. And lastly, it should acknowledge exposure to risks and harms. As for our recommendation, firstly, as our case study focuses on the US obviously should redefine the term atomic veteran based on the 4 key pillars that were just mentioned, so that this definition becomes more inclusive, more historically accurate, more detailed, regularly updated, and aligned with federal laws. And the next step afterwards would be to advocate for a wider adoption of this more compelling and more comprehensive definition at an international scale. Moreover, the US should also release information that relate to its history of nuclear testing, including testing locations as well as test dates, particularly to individuals who are exposed to nuclear risks and harms. This is particularly relevant and should happen in conjunction with the declassification of medical records, because those who were harmed by nuclear testing are required to bear the burden of proof and to state these elements when advancing claims to seek compensation. In addition, we previously talked about RICA and the fact that it lapsed for a second time in April 2024. So RICA should be reintroduced. However, this time the aim should be to have an indefinite extension of RICA in order to allow all individuals who were harmed by nuclear testing an opportunity to apply for benefits or to seek compensation through RICA. More broadly, nuclear armed states should acknowledge that their service members were harmed in the process of these countries developing nuclear weapons, and as such, they should actively work in order to prevent present and future harms. And this can be done mainly through acceding to treaties such as the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which focuses on nuclear testing, but also other related disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control treaties. Overall, in conclusion, the expansion of the definition of atomic veterans to become more comprehensive and based on the 4 key pillars which we stated can benefit service members and all individuals who are exposed to radiation at different sites across the globe, not just inside of the United States. Current compensation schemes in the United States are limited, and this is mainly due to a lack of historical accuracy and detail. Also, the failure of the US government to maintain accurate records of all individuals that were present at nuclear test sites has hindered these individuals' ability from seeking compensation and to redress harms. Lastly, knowledge gaps regarding the impact of nuclear weapons testing, both on the long term and shorter term, have led to a failure in mitigating and or preventing nuclear harms and risks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Morgan and Christelle. Fascinating. And thanks, of course, to all of our presenters. We have now some time for Q&A, a little less than scheduled, but still some time for Q&A. So please do raise a hand, any of the participants, or indeed the panelists, if you have a question. If not, you've all heard far too much from me already, but I will abuse my role as the chair and ask some questions myself if nobody else steps up. Perhaps in that case, I have jotted down some questions for each of the presenters. Perhaps I could address my question to Amanda first, Group 3. I'd be interested to know any thoughts you have on further research that could be carried out in this area. Like if you had unlimited budget and time, what would you, analytically, what would you do next to sort of explore this area further?
I think our key speaker, she mentioned something where one of the main things that climate change and nuclear weapons are tightened, which is how the nuclear weapons, the nuclear arms race contributes to climate change. So I think further research on that, on how all the nuclear armed states modernizing their arsenals is already impacting the environment and producing more carbon and polluting would, I think, would be great. A great focus for research, for future research. Thanks, Dave.
Very much. I can see Declan Penrose has his hand up. Declan, I'd love to hear your question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, everybody, for an excellent presentation and report paper. As reading it was brilliant through the editing process of it. But I want to focus my question to Maheen's focus group on mining in particular. I think what kind of interested me was the geographical spread of uranium mining and also practices around purchasing it for nuclear states. I guess my question was, do you think that it would be possible to kind of enforce through organizations such as the NPT, for example, bans on purchasing uranium from mines that do not meet regulatory standards, or they're not open to safeguards, for example, from like the IAEA, to ensure that it's being mined in a humane way and is not harming the local population and the miners themselves?
Thank you so much for the question. It's a very interesting aspect, and we've looked at it during our research. But it is important that, and we had a lot of discussion on this, that it's important to understand that certain states have certain interests and certain governments have certain interests, and not all of the additional protocols have been ratified. So yes, it is one of our recommendations that concerns regarding regarding environment and human impact should be addressed, and international agencies should take part. But then it will be very, very important for governments to cooperate with the international agencies in order to implement these steps, because as long as the international agencies are not able to cater or work around the interests of the states or the states where uranium mines exist, it will be very difficult to find out a way to cooperate. But if their interests are addressed, and this is the area where we need to work on, is to find a common ground, a common interest where the two parties can work and develop a mutual understanding and have amazing ideas such as like the trust fund idea. And I guess this is what we've discussed in a group, that it's important to have state interests addressed and then moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maheen. I'm actually going to pose a question to Working Group 5 now, to Christelle and Morgan. And I suppose I'm not only abusing my privilege as a chair here, but also having helped to edit your paper. But I know that you did think a little beyond the US case study, and you mentioned in your recommendations sort of universalizing this larger definition. Have you given any thoughts to sort of process-wise what that might look like, trying to internationalize this wider definition?
Well, I guess I'll go first, and then Morgan perhaps can add on some thoughts. But we believe mainly that, first of all, each country should take a close look at its own context, and look at its own pre-existing laws, definitions, and compensation schemes. And that the process should begin obviously with an acknowledgement of the harms that were done or inflicted upon service members and other individuals. So that's the basis or the cornerstone. And after which, using the 4 key pillars of the definition, or the more comprehensive definition that we suggest, there needs to be an accurate review of any working or functional definition that already exists, if there is one regarding atomic veterans, and to compare it to the 4 key pillars and seeing what is lacking in that sense, in order to begin the work towards revamping or adding on to the definition in order to make it more comprehensive and more inclusive, more historically accurate, detailed, and aligned with the laws. Morgan, if you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think Christelle hit everything, all the major points there, but we do have a more specific definition in our paper. I think one thing that makes us different from group 4, which is dealing with like some indigenous groups, for example, which might be like distinct nations or other nations more broadly, that's interstate relations. In theory, like Christelle said, it could be sort of it doesn't have to be an off the rack solution. It can be a, a made to wear type solution where, states individually sort of strike bargains or carve out rights specifically for soldiers. It could be a special like organization within the state that deals with these nuclear issues. I mean, they're lamentable, they happen. And I think in the US case, we have some of the most flagrant examples of this type of exposure. But I think we have the basis for it, but some peculiarities could be hammered out by the state, and depending on what their own state capacity could be. Alternatively, a framework could be amongst nuclear weapon states. The issue with that would be, potentially new nuclear weapon states might not adhere to this as or at all or ever. So I think that's sort of where we're at. I think that's one thing that makes our case sort of interesting and particular is that it's just an intrastate affair. At least the facet that we're looking at in particular. So I think, Christelle hit the major points. We have some more specific recommendations, and that states can sort of tailor what, depending on their own capacity, they could deal with that if the impetus is there themselves.
Thanks very much. I think we've probably got time for maybe a couple more questions. I believe Declan may have another one. So Declan, I'll pass over to you.
Great, thank you, Dave. I was hoping to get another question in, particularly for working group 1, looking at the radiological waste. So for Abubakar and for Shaza, I was interested in seeing you talking about the small modular reactors and the role that they can kind of play in the future, particularly as a lot of the global south, particularly in Africa, for example, there's a lot of hope that SMRs could be key for spreading nuclear energy much further and much more quickly. And also based on kind of similar recommendation, having very similar reactors run in very similar ways across could help kind of spread and expertise quickly to help train people to be able to operate them. Do some of those kinds of benefits regarding the running and the building of these reactors also apply to the management of waste and potentially help with dealing with waste in general if there is a much larger proliferation of nuclear energy based on SMRs?
Yeah, I think, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
The waste management is part and parcel of the core technology. Usually in the nuclear technology, you have people responsible for the power reactors, you have people responsible for the waste management, you have people responsible for some other things. So I think it's just like you said, the training and everything should encompass everything, including the waste management system. You understand? So we're not going to treat it like differently. Let's say we have experts that have to do with operations of the reactors and leaving out the waste management concept of it. So it includes everything, even the question of regulatory issues and all, nuclear security, safeguards, everything is encompassed.
Thanks very much.
And
yes,
and I
Shazza,
would just
do you want to add something?
I would just like to add to what Abubakar said, that in future, if we talk about future research direction, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence.
Thanks very much for that, Shazza. My connection was a bit poor, but I hope others heard you properly. I'll just ask one final question for working group 4. Anaïs, you have a question, please.
Thank you. I had a question for the working group working on the US Nevada test site veterans. I was wondering if you've come across concrete occasions of transnational solidarities amongst various veterans, but also amongst veterans and civil affected community members. Because we witnessed it at the 3MSP a few months ago, these new solidarities being forged, and I wondered what you've noticed in your own research. Thank you.
I can start with this one, Christelle. Yeah, one of the first things that sort of stood out in our research was that there were these veteran groups that weren't associated with like any other organizations. They were just sort of these freestanding groups which were advocating for more coverage or for them to be added to the existing definition, or even for something as small as their service being acknowledged fully, the fact that they were atomic veterans, it being a point of pride for them. The other thing, like in specifically vis-a-vis the Nevada test site, was that it was for a while like this locus point of like controversy, where like it sort of internationally represented a symbol of like the anti-nuclear movement. So in that sense, like that's a different rail. Those two lines ran perpendicular to each other, atomic veterans and sort of the anti-nuclear movement writ large. But there is something there. I think like maybe Christelle, you can talk about this in particular in terms of like U.S. atomic veterans being maybe not a model, but a specific example for veterans abroad.
Yeah, so obviously in the context of the US, we have different compensation schemes. And in other countries, sometimes the compensation is not this fragmented, it's more unified. And US veterans, specifically in recent years, and even throughout the past few decades, have sought to build more solidarity amongst each other and to advocate for the right to seek more compensation, or for the different compensation schemes to be more inclusive and comprehensive of other needs that go beyond monetary compensation and reparations or compensation given solely based on physical injuries. As you mentioned, they have been more actively involved in international fora such as the MSP and other avenues, and they are very open and candid about also sharing their experiences. So we have actually one of our group members who, outside of this project, has actually, for separate research on her own, contacted groups of veterans that they were very open to discussing on the side their struggles, etc., which also inspired some avenues for additional research, particularly in specifying or taking some of the elements or pillars of our definition into account.
Thank you both very much. We're running a little over time, but I'm going to fit in one last question for working group 4, if that's okay with you. I sort of struck by in your presentation that a lot of the issues are founded on this very unequal bilateral relationship between the US and the Marshall Islands. And I wondered if you had any insights on what states and people based in states outside of those two countries can do to help with the problems you're highlighting in your paper.
I think I'll take that, since apologies from Shay. They had to step out. But thanks, Dave, for your question. I think there's a lot that people outside the two respective countries can actually do. I think few of the ways that they can help, I think we highlighted through the policy recommendations, and one was through ensuring that any diplomatic effort that takes place concerning Marshall Islands, or any time this is mentioned, that they do necessarily require the US to acknowledge the harms that are that have been occurred, and this is outside pressure coming in as well. It's for the rest of the states to also put pressure to say, you need to also acknowledge the recognition. So sometimes peer pressure works quite like a charm to try and get the result that we necessarily need. Another way is to is to ensure that inclusive diplomacy is being practiced and to allow the voices of these displaced communities to actually engage in these different forums. And this means making sure that any diplomatic forum that occurs, these countries allow these voices to also be present, and making the administrative process much easier for them to participate as well. I think those are just two of the ways that I can think of off the top of my head, but I think the other ways are highlighted more in detail in our report itself. So I do encourage you to read the report.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for those great answers to those questions. We are going to wrap up very shortly. Before we do that, I just wanted to get a few words from Aisling Burns. This policy cycle is not the last piece of work that BASIC will be doing on this topic. Aisling is a policy fellow at BASIC and project manager of the Nuclear Harms Reduction Project, and is going to tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks so much, Dave, and thank you everyone for having me join this meeting. It's been really, really interesting to learn more about the anthology and also to hear about all of the really impressive work you've been doing. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of a project that's separate to the EVN project, but substantively quite similar, that BASIC is currently undertaking. So it's funded by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and it's been running since last year, and it will run until early next year. And it's part of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Programme team at BASIC. So it aims to address harms associated with nuclear weapons programs and to prevent and mitigate potential future harms as well. For now, we've been defining harms as the negative impacts of nuclear weapons programs on human life and health, on the environment, and also on society. We seek to examine and identify past, present, and potential future harms across the entire nuclear weapons cycle, similar to the approach that you've all been taking with this anthology, ranging from uranium mining all the way up to warhead decommissioning. And the first sort of piece of work that we'll be publishing on this is a holistic framework that will identify a lot of these harms, and this will be published, the first iteration of it, I should say, will be published at the end of the summer. And that will be sort of the initial findings of our research that we're currently conducting at the moment. And we see that as being sort of a living framework that we can continue to update as we continue our research. So I should also mention that this cycle of the project, it's sort of our pilot project of the nuclear harms reduction project, and it's focused in particular on the UK. And this is because we're a UK-based organisation. It seemed like quite a natural starting point. So the project will be examining, for this cycle, the UK's nuclear weapons programme in particular. So we'll be publishing the framework at the end of the summer, and then after that, myself and my colleague Anahita will be spending a few months applying our findings of the framework to the UK context specifically. And then early next year, we'll publish 3 reports, and those will include the findings of our application of the framework to the UK's nuclear weapons programme. So we've taken an intentionally holistic approach, and we are really building upon the earlier work that everyone has done on humanitarian impacts, environmental impacts, risk reduction, and we really seek to identify social and political impacts and highlight the interconnection between all of the various areas of risk that can arise from nuclear weapons programs, and harms, I should say, as well. So the initial phase, really one of our key objectives is to increase public awareness of nuclear weapons harms, and also to increase democratic participation in deliberation over the UK's nuclear weapons programme. We think that's really a key part of what's missing in when it comes to nuclear weapons programs. Sometimes you can find that the public isn't really completely aware of all of the potential harms that are being done to them, being done to the environment, being done to their own societies. And it's such an important issue that there should be much more democratic participation in it. So what we're trying to do as well is to provide a platform through which affected communities can be better heard. And by affected communities, we not specifically, but in particular, we mean the Indigenous communities who have been affected by uranium mining, uranium testing, and also the atomic veterans, as we've just heard. So the approach we've taken to our research so far, we've been quite eager to ensure that we're taking an objective and an unbiased approach to the research. We really want to do this in order to enable the work to be used by a variety of different actors in order to reduce harms. So we want it to be able to be used by advocates of disarmament. We want it to be able to be used for advocates against nuclear testing. We want it to be able to be used by affected communities, but we also want it to be useful to the nuclear weapon states themselves in designing policies that will reduce the harms that their nuclear weapons programs, necessarily emit. So part of that is that we're taking a treaty agnostic approach. So we're not aligning ourselves in particular to any of the disarmament or non-proliferation treaties. However, we are conducting stakeholder engagement and bilateral consultations under the TPNW. We were at the TPNW MSP in March and also at the NPT PrepCom in May. And another rationale for our treaty agnostic approach is that we want this framework to be a tool that serves the relevant treaty context, but it also can exist as a standalone resource. And we think that's quite important given sort of, current state of, international relations and international law. It's very important for this to be a standalone resource and not to be reliant too heavily on the success or the continuation of any particular disarmament or non-proliferation treaty. So as I said, we'll be publishing this framework at the end of the summer, and we really look forward to sharing this with you at that point. And we'd be really interested as well in hearing any feedback you might have. And everything we've heard today has been really informative, I think, in how we're going to continue our research on these issues. And then early next year, we'll be publishing the report that will apply the framework to the UK context, and we'll definitely share it with the EVN network at that point as well. But just to say, thanks again, everyone, for having me, and thank you for such an interesting presentation of all of your findings. It's been really, really helpful.
Thank you so much, Aisling. Really looking forward to seeing the framework and the other outputs of the project as you go forward. It then remains to me to thank all of our presenters and all the policy cycle members who contributed to the anthology. Particular thanks, of course, to our keynote speaker, Anaïs Maurer, and also to my many colleagues in BASIC who helped to work on the anthology in various ways. A particular shout out to Anhita Parsa, who Aisling's just mentioned is now working on the Nuclear Harms Project, but was involved in running this policy cycle at the beginning and doing all the recruitment and all of the first half of the cycle. So particular thanks to her. Do please take the time to read through the anthology if you haven't already. We've only really scratched the surface here. There's lots and lots of really great stuff in there, and I know I'll be returning to it many times in the future. The video of this event will go live on the BASIC YouTube channel and on our website quite soon. For those of you who are EVN members, please don't forget about the masterclass we have from John Osmundson on multilateral nuclear disarmament verification and case for science diplomacy this Thursday, 1 p.m. British Standard Time. For those of you who are not EVN members, you'll be able to catch that online very soon afterwards. Thank you so much to everyone for coming, and hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.